Ghost stories have been around for hundreds of years, and every culture has their strange ghost tales to tell. There is no doubt that ghost stories will always be with us and have become part of our folklore. But what causes ghosts to appear is interesting, as there appear to be different types of hauntings. In some cases, the ghost is aware of your presence and may attempt to communicate in a friendly manner or is downright evil. Another type of eerie event is called a residual haunting, which is not exactly a ghost but a playback of a past event and will repeat this over and over again. For example, have you read about a spirit that walks across a room then appears to walk through a non-existent door? However, you'll find later that there used to be a door in that location. It seems residual hauntings can go on for centuries, where in some cases people have even seen Roman armies marching down a road that no longer exists. The following are 4 true stories told by Australians about their experiences with the supernatural. Number 4. The following story was told by an elderly lady many years ago about eerie events that happened to her when she was a young woman. She said, "My father and myself had recently moved into a current house in the late 19th century in Albert Park, a suburb of Melbourne. When we first moved in, there was an eerie atmosphere and was always freezing even when it was hot outside, and it always felt depressing. Because I did not like the atmosphere, I hated being alone, and after a while, I had this strange feeling that somebody was watching me. One morning, when I was in the kitchen washing up, it suddenly became freezing cold. I remember that I turned around for some reason, and then I saw her, a little girl standing in the doorway, but not watching me, but looking down at the floor. She was milky white, and I could see through her. I thought, my God, it's a ghost, a real ghost. Strangely though, I wasn't frightened, but I was just thinking, I will never forget this moment. The young girl looked about 8 years old and wore the sort of clothes I did when I was young, such as buttoned-up boots, a white frilly dress with an apron over it, and she had long hair. But I couldn't help thinking how terribly sad she looked, and then she suddenly disappeared. I was able to find out that many years ago a couple lived in the house with an only child, a little girl about 8 years old who had died of pneumonia, and her description fitted the girl I had seen. A few months later my father had lost his job, so we had to take in a boarder, a young school teacher. Unfortunately, she did not stay very long. One morning she came down to breakfast and asked, "Who was the young girl who came into my room last night?" My father said, "Young girl? There's no young girl living here." She said, "But there must be. She's about 8, with long hair, wearing a long white dress. I woke up and it was terribly cold, and there she was, bending over and looking at me." She then said, "There's something funny going on in this house, and I'm not staying." And with that she immediately packed and left. Number 3. The next story was told by Pauline of Lane Cove, New South Wales, of an event that happened to her in 1976. She had just started working as a babysitter in the suburb of Sydney called Hunters Hill. It was an old house perched on the edge of Sydney Harbour. It was her first night on the job, and after her parents left for the opera, Pauline checked that the children were fast asleep and then found a well-stocked library and settled down to read. She said that around 10:30 p.m, I started feeling very cold and went into the kitchen to make a cup of tea. She sat down with her tea and everything was quiet until she suddenly heard a deep sigh. She thought it must be from the wind outside. Then she heard the sigh again, but this time it was deeper and louder, and it was coming from behind her. She spun around and there was a greyish white figure of a woman standing on the stairs in a long dress with a shawl around her shoulders and long hair hanging down. Her face was in shadow so she couldn't tell her age, and her clothes were very old-fashioned, and she just stood there motionless, except for her hands. She was wringing her hands as though she was terribly agitated. Strange though, I wasn't scared. I was fascinated and calm, and I said to her, "Hello, who are you?" She did not reply, but stood there wringing her hands. Then she started to move towards me. Not walking, but appeared to glide as if her feet were off the floor. I didn't move. I wasn't game to. And then she went right past me towards a door leading to the back garden and vanished. When the parents came home, I said to them, "You have a ghost?" And he replied quietly, "Yes, there is a spirit with us." The mother then said, "Well, myself and my daughter have seen it too." I was surprised they were so calm. I asked them, "Do you know who she is and why she's here?" "Oh yes," the wife replied. "I did some research and found she was a servant girl around the turn of the century, and apparently she was married to a sailor who one day went to sea and never came back. His ship must have gone down somewhere and she refused to believe it and spent all of her spare moments in the garden waiting for him to come home." I asked them why they did not warn me, and they said, "We tried warning previous babysitters and they wouldn't stay, and we didn't want to be stuck again without a babysitter." Number 2. Pat Cleary lived in Sydney and belonged to a strict Roman Catholic family, so anything to do with spirits or psychics in general was seen as evil. But what happened to her at 2 a.m. one morning made her question her Catholic faith. There was a loud voice saying, "Wake up, Pat, wake up," and she recognised the voice as that of her sister who had died 12 months previously. Because Pat always overslept, believes it was her sister telling her to get up for work. But things were about to get weirder when one morning she saw her sister standing by the side of her bed dressed in the kind of clothes that she used to wear and looked as solid as if she were still alive. However, this time her sister did not say a word but just smiled at her. Pat was petrified and she just laid there afraid to speak. And then her sister slowly faded and disappeared. After that, her sister appeared on a number of occasions, and each time she woke me with the same words. And once she appeared with the spirit of their late mother, who sat on the end of her bed. The visits went on for about 9 months, and then just stopped. Pat then visited her priest, who said she was being tempted by evil spirits, and Pat just looked at him and said, "Why would someone who looked like my sister bother to visit me at 2 a.m. in the morning, telling me to wake up or smile at me?" Well, the priest had no explanation. Pat later visited a spiritualist church in Parramatta, where a medium communicated with her dead brother, who told her not to worry about what she'd been taught, but to go her own way. Pat was later to find out that the reason she was able to see her sister and mother was because she was psychic and decided to develop her own powers and became a medium. She left the Catholic Church and later became president of the Enmore Spiritual Church in Sydney. Number 1. In 1969, Jean Robertson and her husband lived in Sydney and lived next door to a couple who had a 12-year-old daughter called Linda, who had long blonde hair. Jean said that as she was an only child, the parents doted on her and gave her everything. Unfortunately, the child was an asthmatic and one day suffered a serious attack where she died. Linda's parents were so devastated that they could no longer stay in the house and abruptly left. The house was let out, and in the following months, a succession of tenants moved in and out. One of the tenants was chatting with Jean and said that she was not happy living there as it was always cold and she always had the feeling that there was somebody else in the house with them. In 1972, a couple moved in and introduced themselves and asked whether anything unusual had ever happened in the house. Jean was reluctant to tell them about the young girl who tragically died a few years earlier. Jean then said, "Why do you ask?" The woman said that the previous night she'd had a nightmare. When she woke up, the bedclothes were everywhere and also screwed up on her hands. In her dream, a little girl about 12 years old with long blonde hair came to her. Jean then asked if the young girl had given her name, and the woman said yes. She said her name was Linda. That couple eventually moved out, and another couple with 2 young children moved in. A short time later, the new neighbours befriended a few of the other neighbours and asked one of them, called Judy, who lived across the road, whether she would babysit for them, as they wanted to go out to celebrate their wedding anniversary. By this time, most people in the street were aware of the house's reputation and were reluctant to go inside. However, Judy decided to help them out and agreed to babysit. On entering the property, Judy noticed that their German Shepherd refused to go inside and just stood outside with his tail down and preferred to stay out in the cold. Judy went inside and checked that the children were asleep, and as she was walking down the hallway towards the back of the house, she heard a child call out, "Mummy, Mummy!" She quickly ran into the bedroom to see which child was awake, but found them both fast asleep. Puzzled, she proceeded down the hall again, which was littered with suitcases and unpacked boxes. But as she got closer, they all seemed to spread apart, and standing quite still and as plain as day stood Linda, holding a painting of sunflowers in a gold frame. Judy said the apparition called Mummy 3 times and then disappeared, whereas the boxes closed in again as before. Judy was terrified, but forced herself to stay until the parents came home and said that wild horses would not make her go back into that house. They made inquiries about the painting, where a friend of the dead girl's parents told them that there had been a sunflower painting in the house, painted by the young girl's mother. Some weeks later, an elderly aunt of Jean came to visit her and said that as she was walking past a neighbour's house, she saw a young girl standing on the balcony with long blonde hair. However, the young couple with the 2 young children were not at home. They were away on holiday.